On behalf of your host, the Global Crop Diversity Trust, short Crop Trust, and welcome to all of you in the room and those of you joining us via live stream. My name is Ute Lange. I will guide you through this evening. I'm looking forward to it. On this year's Crop Diversity Day, we will talk about food security and crop diversity, actionable solutions for a healthy world. Our event has several parts. We will have welcoming addresses, a keynote, a panel discussion, after which we will hear some reflections from invited experts. And after all these sections, we will have a chance at a reception to network and sort of dive deeper into some of the subjects that we'll be discussing here. I will introduce our speakers to you as they come onto the stage, and I have a technical note. We will invite you to join our panel discussion, and we'll use Slido for that. If you haven't checked out the information, how to join us there, you may do this now, and you have a chance to go to either the website, slido.com, and then type in the numbers 220926. Here in the room, you may also use the QR code. So feel free to just join the application. You don't need to sign in. You don't need to register. Just either use the QR code or type in the numbers. I'll let you know once we start using Slido, so you know when to get ready for that. Enough of all the introductions. Maybe one more. Some of you have already found the drinks section, so if you want some water or some refreshments, feel free to take them. And now please welcome with me Dr. Stefan Schmitz, Executive Director of the Global Crop Diversity Trust, a hidden champion within the Vaughan NGOs, which will become hopefully more known to all of us this evening. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Yes. Welcome. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. Hardly anybody knows about the importance of crop diversity. With this event, we want to change this. That is better to say with these events, as we see this, our first crop diversity, as a kick-off for a series of events and hopefully to become our annual flagship event in the future. Crop diversity, we will learn about this later. It has always been important since man is doing agriculture, but it is now even more becoming more important in times of climate change. Researchers, plant breeders, and farmers take out of the existing diversity to create something new that is better adapted to environmental circumstances. Food systems now are really shaken. We all see this after now during the war in the world, but already before this new situation, food systems had been fragile. And we have to carefully think, what can we do about it? There is no magic bullet to it, but one thing I can say for sure, there is no sustainable food system without crop diversity. It's a necessary condition for that, and we will learn about it. New varieties may be better adapted to heat and drought. Rediscovered old varieties and newly developed diversity can contribute to overcoming poverty in the rural areas of the global south. Examples include the use of varieties that deliver high yields under extreme conditions, have better storage and processing properties, or have better nutrient efficiency and thus require less fertilizer. Rediscovered and newly developed crop diversity can be used to produce food that is richer in micronutrients and therefore more valuable for human diets and nutrition. This is becoming increasingly urgent as many of today's conventional crop varieties have decreasing nutritional value under rising temperatures. Crops with higher protein content can advance the shift from a heavily meat-based to a predominantly plant-based diet in affluent societies. There are all crucial contributions to agriculture to feed people within our planet's limits. Variety, diversity matters. The crop trust takes care for that diversity because crop diversity is threatened all over the place. It is threatened in the fields, it is threatened in nature where all the crop wild relatives are, and they are threatened in gene banks in case they are not properly funded, and that is the case in many cases of the global south. So the crop trust is a caretaker for conservation and use of plant genetic resources of crop diversity to make it available for a better life of people and for a healthy planet. Today or tonight, we would like to present to you what crop diversity is all about, but at the same time, we would also like to learn from you, get your feedback, your perspectives, your questions, your concerns about it, so that communication is not a one-way street, but really communication. Thank you for coming, and I wish you a nice evening and nice discussions. Thank you very much.
Now you know what this evening is going to be all about, and we now welcome Dr. Ursula Sauter, the Deputy Mayor of the Federal City of Bonn. Welcome to you.
A very good early evening to you, dear Executive Director Schmitz, esteemed panelists and guests. I am truly delighted to welcome you on this afternoon on behalf of Mayor Katja Dörner, who cannot be here today, unfortunately, and to convey her warmest regards to the crops diversity community. I'm not just saying that I'm delighted, I truly am, and I'll tell you why. At home, I have a little seedling. It's about that high, and it's a Weinberg Pfirsich. It's a Vineyard Peach, and it comes from the old vineyards on the Moselle River, just 120 kilometers to the south, and belongs to my husband's family. You will never ever find Weinberg's Pfirsiche in a supermarket. They're very small, they're very tough, and they're very red. No, they're actually more like beetroot colored. They have been brought in by the Romans, at least that's what the story is, a long time ago, and they have adapted to the climate down there at the Moselle, where the ground is very steep and it's mostly, what is it called, Schiefer? It's shale, I think. So, thank you. So, this wonderful little plant, they are being pulled out as the vineyards are amalgamated, as the vineyards are, intensified. So, I love my little seedling because I keep thinking, if it didn't exist, I wouldn't have the most wonderful little peaches one day to put on a cake. So this is why I'm really glad that I'm here, because you guys are taking care of crop diversity. I've been talking about the Romans 2,000 years ago. We are at a pivotal moment in time now, hoping for the next conference of the parties on biodiversity to adopt the post-2020 framework, and hopefully also a new action plan for cities and regions, if I may say so. On the eve of the second part of COP15 on biodiversity, we are also debating the next level of our local, Bonn-related local biodiversity strategy and action plan. And you all know that as much as the climate emergency may challenge us, we experience every day how deeply climate, land, water, air, food, security are connected. You can't differentiate between them. It's all one big thing that we're talking about. A loss of crops diversity is a threat to our common future. People producing and relying on staple crops are suffering from a deficiency of micronutrients. Crop diversity will be an imperative as we are struggling to feed the ever-growing population of our planet Earth, as Stefan Schmitz and his team know best. In our joint efforts to achieve SDG number 2, zero hunger, we need to place a focus on providing enough food, but also to make our food production sustainable and our food healthy. Looking at the UN campus on the Rhine, somewhere around there, no, there, and the large resident cluster of sustainability key players from all areas, from the UN level, from the EU level, we set our hope on multilateralism and on collaborative action from local to global when it comes to implementing all of the sustainable development goals that we've just been celebrating a couple of days ago. Let me share with you a couple of related best practices that we find here in Bonn. Our BioCities initiative promotes and advances organic farming in our city and region. On our annual spring market, locals and visitors can get an incredible variety of seeds and seedlings, but no vineyard peaches. Our local urban gardening initiatives are also a way of supporting crop diversity and community spirit. There are several in my area, and it's always great to walk past. On the academic side, I'd like to mention the crops garden of our botanical gardens, showcasing rare local crops like the little Bonn pea or the Bonn Advent cabbage, and hosting a regular swap market for seeds. The research community indeed plays an important part in this context, also in terms of networking, which is probably why I see so many people with a professor title and a doctor title here. The Vaughan network, for instance, brings together the UN with the local level, ethics with botany, and assessment with protection and education. In the face of the global challenges that we are facing, we definitely need to pull and streamline our resources. If I may say so, I'll look at the disastrous effects that the Ukraine crisis has had on the supply of grain, for instance, and other staples, should tell us that we need to diversify and we need to produce locally, nationally at least. On this Global Crop Diversity Day, I would like to express our gratitude to the Global Crop Diversity Trust for your excellent work. May it continue. May you be able to not only preserve the variety of crops we have, but to actually increase them. I'm willing to give you my seedling. One of them. We also need to realize that crop diversity is not only a matter of choice, we discussed that on the table, but also a matter of resilience. It is in this changing world, let's make our crops healthy and stable. I'd like to stress that again, not staple. My special thanks therefore go again to Stefan Schmitz for hosting this Global Crops Diversity Day and bringing together the community from all over the place and sending out a strong signal to the world that what you're doing is important. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor of the City of Bonn. I think at the end of the evening, everyone wants a seedling. I kind of have a feeling. Now we have, as I mentioned earlier, a keynote to start off this evening of sharing knowledge and networking. And welcome with me Professor Dr. Joachim von Braun. He's Professor for Economic and Technological Change, President of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences of the Vatican, and a member of the Executive Board of the Crop Trust. Welcome very much, Professor Braun.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for the invitation, Stefan. It's a great day. Deputy Mayor Dr. Sauter, thank you for your commitment to seeds and to plants. Bonn is a beautiful city. but more can be done. I look forward when all front yards are no longer covered with gravel and stone in my neighborhood, in the Südstadt of Bonn. I look to you and city planners to change that. It would change the landscape of Bonn. Colleagues, I'm asked to make a few opening remarks, and I know there are very important panel discussions following. So I will be addressing some of the broader issues of the food systems in crisis, causes, consequences, solutions, and the key role of seeds. That's really the message. I will address actually these two issues. You also have a screen over there. I understand you can all see, except me. Okay. I want not to talk too much about the crisis causes, but we must remember it's a multidimensional food crisis of these 7 issues which trouble us. The COVID-19 disruptions of food value chains actually have led to a boost in inflation and to large debts in developing countries. The climate change destroys food system resilience. Stefan mentioned already that, and I will come back to it. Wars add to the uncertainties and hinder trade. The inflation leads to hunger, and healthy diets are less and less affordable for about 4 billion people who cannot afford a healthy diet anymore. The high energy prices and the raw materials, the fertilizer costs, constrain agriculture and the food industries. Seed are very important, but there are other inputs, water and fertilizer, who make plants grow. We need to have them together. I mentioned the debts. What's currently happening is that many developing countries went into debt for good reasons. They expanded their social security networks. So debt relief is required in the coming years. And we have the destruction of nature, the erosion of biodiversity, and the erosion of food security connected to that. So there are cause and effect relationships. The food system is under resilience stress on nutrition, on markets and services I mentioned, agriculture and processing, and the income and employment side are under stress. Stress of climate, of wars, and of macroeconomy. We need to take a food systems perspective and see the opportunities of seeds in that context. Climate change has led to already to a decline in crop yields. What's colored red here is a percentage change in yields between present and 2015. So these are model results. And you see that these yield reductions are predominantly happening in the global south, but also in parts of Europe, for instance, Spain, for water reasons and heat stress. Global hunger was going down, but it has, in the last 5 years, turned into a very unhealthy direction, upward trends. Let's not forget that progress was made in the last 40, 50 years. The world had a lot more people in hunger, proportionally and absolutely, 40 years ago. Seed innovation, agronomy, and the gene banks, which provided the basis for that, have made a difference in this. Some things have gone wrong. With environmental side effects, so-called externalities of what used to be called green revolution. We have learned that lesson, but good seeds and agronomic practices improvement have brought hunger down, were a critical factor in bringing hunger down, and will have to play a critical role for the long term in the future. The loss of biodiversity and the food system are in a complex relationship. We will address this evening, Stefan, I understand, especially agrobiodiversity, and that is very important to be understood as a component of the general biodiversity. Sort of the evolution given biodiversity and the evolution of humankind given agrobiodiversity, which humanity has created in the last 12,000 years by plant developments. So there's a direct effect between current food production systems that drive degradation of land, soils, and biodiversity losses. There's an indirect way via consumption. We have to talk about consumption sustainability and not only about production. And there's indirect impacts on biodiversity due to climate change, which ultimately is also a function of production and consumption. So, but land use and land use change are leading causes of the loss of biodiversity. Let's come to solutions. And we had last year the Food Systems Summit. Here is the Secretary General made these 5 key points in his closing statement, in his address to the nations. He singled out 2 approaches. One, a country-level approach matters. So, country by country, I add, Deputy Mayor, city by city, and regions, not only global, but also global, is important. Nourish all people, boost nature-based solutions. So that's bioeconomy, nature-based solutions, circular economy, equitable livelihoods, decent work, and empowered communities. Building resilience to vulnerability, shocks, and stresses. That's where the climate issue comes in. And number 5, accelerate the means of implementation. Not just talk, but action with implementation. And we in science have to focus on that. You can quickly glance that more than 160 countries have mapped out their plans and lots of initiatives. This Food Systems Summit was different from all 7 former UN summits on food. It had a key role allocated to science, independent science advice. So there was a scientific group advising on it. And there's written science all over the place, quite unusually in the Secretary General's statement. I suggest you take a look at the 5 pages. So these were the science issues which we advocated from the scientific group for the summit, and many of them relate to crop diversity and seed and sustainable transformation of the food system. First, a bundle of context-specific policy and institutional innovations to end hunger. That's a package. De-risk the food system. That's where crop diversity comes in. Monoculture, relying on few varieties in agriculture is risky. It's risky. And poor people and the world as a whole cannot afford that risk. Innovations for efficient, fair land credit and labor arrangements is important. The bioscience innovations, the soil, land, water, and protect the agricultural genetic base and biodiversity is a single key issue in conjunction the biodiversity with other resources. We emphasize that this is not only a terrestrial summit, but the blue side of the food system needs to be considered, including, by the way, the biodiversity in the blue system and digital innovations cutting across. Let me briefly highlight here this complicated curve. No, it's not complicated. What you find there is a list of actions, optimal actions, grouped by the cost they require to bring incrementally people out of hunger. The bottom line is to 1.1 billion, and the intervention cost per undernourished people. Let me only emphasize what are the least cost, the lowest cost interventions. I wrote there seeds critical role across them. That is agriculture, research and development, extension services, ICT and information services, small-scale irrigation, and agricultural R&D. So all these include working with seeds, improving seeds. It's the lowest cost interventions if invested at this scale until 2030, year after year, would bring about 400 million people out of hunger. Thereafter, we also have to invest in social protection, social security, and you can glance at it, trade improvement, infrastructure, and so on. It is actually not so expensive to approach a world without hunger, and we have to get it done. And improving the seed systems and protecting the seeds diversity in order to reduce the risks of the investments of cutting hunger fast is critical. Climate change requires crop variety adaptation. Stefan, you mentioned that already. Protecting agrobiodiversity, addressing the risks, requires robust, sustainable, secure storage places, such as this famous place in Spitzbergen. We must strengthen the ex situ conservation. That's in the gene banks. A system for hard-to-conserve materials is also necessary. Information about genetics and phenotyping, the science needs to advance what we have all in these gene banks and innovative funding of this system. So that requires also protecting of the so-called in situ, so the plant genetic diversity in the fields. Protected zones, zoos, botanical gardens, natural history museums, and parks play a role in this crowded world to protect what used to be nature, which is no more. But Noah's Ark for the 21st century will not be sufficient to comprehensively limit the loss of species and establishing islands of protection. We need fundamental change in society, reintegration of people with nature in a bioeconomy, biosociety system. That is required. I'm always asked by a good colleague, Joachim, why do you put this picture up? If you look carefully, as soon as the animals come out, they are eating each other again. You see that lion down there? The peaceful environment of the Noah's Ark image is destroyed here. Of course, we need peace among species, especially among the human species. That brings me to policy and governance challenges to deal with complex global food crisis. I've listed here a few key issues. Let me only mention the first two bullets. The UN Food System Summit has kicked off a process which goes on until 2030, monitoring, revisiting. So it was not a one-shot meeting last year. And that is, I think, good news to keep the system on its toes, because there are needs for governance reform. And the same applies to G7 and G20 and the interaction with each other and the United Nations food system. We need to identify food as a large island of consensus between nations which are currently at odds with each other, such as the US and China. We need systems change, overcoming monoculture at field level. Technology can play a role. crop diversity is essential at field level. We need to reduce the indirect costs of the food system. In the markets, $9 trillion are paid every year in the markets and supermarkets. But the indirect costs of the food system are 28 trillion, so 3 times the 9. What are these costs? There are health costs, there are environmental costs, there are the cost of losing biodiversity, a big ticket item because of the risk aspect, and there are costs of infrastructure due to the climate stress and volatile climate systems. So the unsustainable and unhealthy food is too cheap, and sustainable and healthy food is too expensive. We need to come out of that dilemma. We need to come to proper, true prices. I think the COP26, Glasgow, had some interesting and important aspects, but it completely failed on our agenda of this evening. The word water, the word food, the word land, the word agriculture is not mentioned at all in the global statement, outcome statement of Glasgow. That needs to change in COP27, and it will change. I know there are already 2 pavilions on food. There's a session on food and nutrition. So I think it's an opportunity, Stefan, for Crop Diversity Trust to engage also at that level. The biodiversity protection must also be reconsidered in certain aspects. There's general agreement of the avoid, restore, reduce, regenerate, and transforms. You can quickly glance what needs to happen there. But these appeals, which I think we all can subscribe to, practically do not consider trade-offs about people's food security. So people need to enter the biodiversity agenda in a proper trade-off consideration. So let me conclude by policy to reduce crisis effects, with which I started out. We need a short-term and a long-term agenda. And let me just focus on the long-term, because that's where the seeds primarily come in. Although currently in the food crisis in South Asia and in parts of Africa, seed availability, access to good seed are a limiting factor to grow out of the crisis too. So seeds are on both short-term and long-term. But we need a massive increase in agricultural productivity, sustainably so, where seeds are critical. But fundamentally, worldviews need to change in the Anthropocene. Never forget how thin that layer around our globe is. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think there's a lot of food for thought and a lot of aspects to now follow up on in the panel discussion. Before we start the panel discussion, there needs to be a little furniture rearranging up front and maybe some water for the panelists on the little tables. While that is happening, let me introduce the panelists. Who feels in charge of this furniture rearranging? Oh, they're already there. Thank you. We have, in alphabetical order, on the panel, Dr. Frank Begemann, Director Biological Diversity, Ecological Farming, Climate, International Affairs at the Federal Office for Agriculture and Food. And I would like to have you here. Thank you. We have Professor Dr. Anna-Katharina Hornitsch, Director of the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. Welcome to you. Let me put you here. This is a gender-balanced panel tonight.
Very nice.
And I'm actually putting it out of balance because I'm the third woman. Dr. Dr. Stefan Kachel-Ries-Matte is Senior Program Manager at the Fund International Agricultural Research at Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, which most of us know as GIZ. I'll put you here, please, sir. And then we have Professor Dr. Claudia Warning, International Center for Sustainable Development at the Hochschule Bonn-Rhein-Sieg, which is a University of Applied Science in our region. Welcome. I would like to take this seat. There's going to be some water for you soon. For those of you wanting to join this conversation, now's the moment to make sure that you know how to work Slido. It's very easy. Once you've entered the page using the QR code or the digits, you can just type in your question. You can also like questions, so I can see which ones are most relevant to this audience. And I have a team in the background who's helping me keep track of all the questions, because we expect loads of questions. So don't disappoint us, please. Let me start with you, Professor Hornich. Agriculture is generally called a victim of climate change, but also a perpetrator, because it contributes significantly to the climate crisis. Are there fundamental recommendations from the scientific perspective, a think tank, a well-known think tank here in Bonn, on how agriculture could escape from this dilemma? Because we need it, but it's also causing a lot of our problems.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you for having me here. Thank you for the kind invitation. Now, first of all, I would like to start by referring to the speech by Antonio Guterres last week, just a few days ago, in which he reminded us of the aspect that in 2022 we don't really have a food shortage issue, but a distributional issue. Now, this is not new, but it's important to remind all of us of it. It's an issue that calls for keeping the markets open, that we also already heard just now, and that reminds us also of the fact that distribution, of course, has a lot to do with then also storage facilities, with the facilities of preservation and for processing in a whole range of countries. On a second note, I would like to come in with regard to your question also on agrobiodiversity, which Rolda said. Can agrobiodiversity play? Should it play? We here, of course, know that the diversity in the gene pool with regard to plants, but also with regard to livestock and also with regard to fisheries, is playing a crucial role in the resilience of food systems and also in the resilience of societies. And if we then look at it from the perspective of the diversity of livelihood provision on the level of households, that becomes even more emphasized, that the diversity of income generation in nature-dependent contexts or in heavily nature-dependent contexts is of crucial importance. Third, I want to come in with a recommendation by the WBGU, which I'm a member of, but drawing on one of its Hauptgutachten, its main books that was written before I joined, and it reminds us of the spillover effects, the transregional spillover effects of our own doing. It was mentioned already. Our own meat consumption, of course, also heavily contributes to intensification, to monocultures, and to a decrease of agrobiodiversity, and also then diverse income strategies on the level of households in Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia. And calls for looking at agriculture and its linkage with climate change and its contributions to climate change out of the perspective of our own doorstep. Thanks.
There's a lot to pick up on later, but let's listen to some of the panelists, and then I invite you to also interact, and we already have some questions and comments on Slido. Dr. Frank Begemann. the world's population is growing. Resources are becoming scarcer. We heard about it from Professor von Braun. The Earth is getting warmer. Biodiversity is dwindling. What changes are needed on a political level? You have been to the meeting of the treaty, the Global Treaty of Genetic Resources, the Plant Treaty short. So that was last week. And are there changes in the discussion, or is it same every other year?
Okay, let me first say I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for inviting me. A correction, I was not in New Delhi last week, so if we have more questions on that, there is Luigi or Imke
yes.
or other colleagues that had been there. But since you're asking me more general, not the last meeting of the treaty, which was actually my first, which I did not attend since its being, I would say the political level or these kind of meetings, and that is the treaty, the plant treaty, as well as, to my understanding, the CBD as well, is too much focusing on politics in terms of ABS questions, access benefit sharing, and digital sequence information issues, which are not directly, to my understanding, helping very much in overcoming the problems we have just heard about. So my wish, my recommendation would rather be that we refocus on more technical issues, on more scientific issues. Comes to CBD, we definitely need to focus on objective one, to have really a conservation approach, and that is the same for the plant treaty. We no longer talk about conservation, we just talk about ABS and access to whatever, but the whatever is disappearing. Yeah, so we can wonderfully discuss about benefit sharing arising, the benefits arising from the use of genetic resources, but if we lose the genetic resources themselves, there is nothing to share. And therefore, I would also think we have heard from Joachim von Braun that, of course, it matters what happens in the countries themselves. Yes, it's important when it comes to diversification of our agriculture systems, and the transformation process is extremely important. But when it comes to these kind of policy framework settings, it's my firm belief, really, that we need to go much more multilateral. Multilateral instead of bilateral. We should establish real, it might be a virtual, but it needs to be a real global gene bank, yeah, as a decentral system of many gene banks, but it needs to be that. And in Europe, we have just developed a kind of a draft strategy proposing real European collections, and not just have a collection at IPK in Gartersleben, at CGN in Wageningen, at the Nordgene, but we need to have a European approach to that. And looking to Stefan, that would be something for the Crop Trust. We need to really have a global gene bank system, global collections. The setting would be there with the multilateral system of the treaty, fine. But the inclusion of material is much too little. So we need to focus really on the conservation. We need to also look what is in the collections. The collections, it's not only that we see in farmers' fields, the rice, maize, and wheat and so forth, the main crops, basically is the CG mandate crops. No, we need to look into these underutilized crops. If we really want to have a diversification, we need to look into what Joachim also was saying on the UNFSS proposal. We look into a transformation process towards a more plant-based diet, and that looks like we need more legumes, vegetables, berries, fruits, and so forth. Where are they? They're disappearing. If we really had them here integrated in our land system, you have indirect impacts straight on biodiversity, on the butterflies, on the birds, on whatever, yeah, because you get much more structures in the agricultural fields. And therefore, I'm very certain that a refocus on scientific, on technical issues would very much help, instead of always having these very artificial discussions on what is the percentage of benefit sharing, what can I get out of it. It's also not the case that there would be no money to support capacity building or development in countries that need capacity development. I agree very much to that, but it doesn't have to come out of the use of the genetic resources. It's a very wrong understanding, a very wrong hypothesis. The money that we need in developing countries or in the countries of the global south is much bigger, the funding needs, but the funding needs are, we can do that. It's not a shortage of funding. The funding is there. Maybe we hear from GIZ in a short while. But we have a very wrong paradigm, yeah? That the money needs to be created from the genetic resources. What a wrong message, really, since CBD. Maybe that is, for the time being, something I would love to say.
It's a great basis for discussion, because I see Professor Vaughan already going. Would you like to immediately react to this? Or would you like another question?
Oh, well, if you allow me.
Yes,
thank
please.
you also
I saw
for
the
inviting
reaction,
me.
so I'm interested.
And using this new device, which I didn't know up to now, I love this question of Srini. She asked, I think it's Sri, she asked, where's the smallholder? So we are discussing now from the middle of the chain in which we are. If we look at the question how to deal with hunger, and I think that's the starting question, how to deal with hunger, we have to see that about half of those people in the world who go hungry to bed are smallholders. So these are the producers. Why is it that we have producers of food who go hungry to bed? And here I think we have to open and widen our discussion on the question, how comes that these people are hungry? How comes these people obviously lost access to food variety and are using food and crops which demand from them a high input, financial input, and which don't give them enough in return when they go out and sell their foods. So what I think which we need to include into this debate is the question on how do we bring those producers into the pictures who have a lot to give to the community, who can be stewards of crop diversity and who are partially stewards, and who had been in the past stewards of it. And who are now very often in a, let's say, vicious circle of buying seeds which are not their seeds, of buying fertilizers which we don't have enough right now, of using pesticides which are not healthy, and so on. So I would like to bring this perspective into the debate, including, by the way, including indigenous communities who often claim themselves to be stewards of biodiversity, including crop diversity. So we need, I think, we need a lot of awareness rising and coming back to the ancient knowledge over there and marry that with scientific knowledge. And we need to not only getting these knowledges being combined, but we need to have also economic impulses for those communities to go back to a kind of agriculture which gives them higher yield, which gives them more resilience, which helps them to reduce their input costs, and which gives them access to the market. And there's a whole, I mean, this is a whole world behind that. I mean, I'm talking about infrastructure, markets, credit, access to credit, and so on. So whenever we're discussing here, I would like to have them sitting in the room, because these are the people who suffer hunger and who can be a huge part of the solution. And when we talk about that, we also have to see not only governments and the systems around, we have to see what is the industry, the agriculture industry doing, and what is their contribution. So I'm very much with you saying, it's not a question of funding. Money is there. It's never been a question of money. The question is how do we root that and where do we put emphasis on?
Thank you. We already also have a question about how can agro and food companies maybe contribute more, because that's where the money goes. Maybe they can contribute a little more. I'll take that up. Let's talk to you, because you were just addressed as sort of the organization with the money, if I heard this correctly. Stefan Kacharis-Matis, what importance does German Development Corporation give to the issue of food security, crop diversity? I mean, like the whole issue that we have on the table tonight.
Yeah. Maybe I need to address one element first, also, as have been asked. So, GIZ is not a funder, of course. We are acting on behalf of the German Ministry for Development Cooperation. So, therefore, also, yes, we handle resources that are given to us for that particular purpose, of course. And where I'm coming from, also, the Fund for International Agricultural Research actually puts a lot of resources, funding into international agricultural research. And Joachim von Breun just mentioned also the possible effectiveness of such investments. So I think that's very, very important to state. But coming back to your question also, sort of when I look at it. So food security for rural and urban population also is a key element of German development cooperation and what we have been doing, and is a key capacity of GIZ support to development partners. So now I want to, reacting to Mrs. Warning also, sort of, I would add inclusiveness, diversity, and particularly crop diversity also are key elements of our approaches also in development cooperation, and to improve the resilience of food systems, because in the introductory statement had been clearly said also, we have seen sort of how mono-value chain-minded also food systems suffer very quickly also from shocks, and we have seen it on the diagrams also that we have in a situation of multiple crises. We know that diversity is key to build more resilient food systems also. So, and then from GIZ's perspective, through our projects and programs, so of course we supported adaptation, for example, to climate change, to changing economic conditions in agri-food systems for a healthy and more food secure future for rural and urban populations. It has been said in the statement of Joachim Braun as well also that food security, we have made considerable progress in past decades, where we see ourselves now also in a situation where that previous effort also needs to be rebuilt. In GIZ, we had a long discussion also recently also, build back better also. Sort of, yes, we know that we have to catch up again with a certain situation, but we also need to make it sort of more resilient also, that we are less dependent or less vulnerable to those external shocks that we are currently experiencing. Then coming to the particular aspect of supporting agrobiodiversity, yes, the Fund for International Agricultural Research and GIZ supports those international gene banks also through our support to the CG system, also not only CG systems but also others also. Recently also, as a reaction to the current situation, we are supporting ICRISAT Gene Bank and World Vect Gene Bank to support, together with crop trusts, also small-scale farmers with seed packages to rebuild systems also. We have a current proposal also in situations where Pakistan, where sort of large areas are flooded, where you also would need to look at also what type of varieties are needed. And therefore also we are supporting gene banks also to preserve. Yes, we understand, and I think there's a very important question there already also, and it's not only the in situ or the ex situ conservation in gene banks, we also need to build resilient systems also, because the variety of crops that we are seeing also is not necessarily a result of recent science and innovation also is a result of thousands of years of small-scale farmers' selection processes, or when you look at crop diversity or diversity with animals or aquatic food. So recognizing that and making these systems more important is so we work with a broad range of partners, because you said also what we have learned, and that's why I included that inclusiveness. Also what we learned also, we had a multi-sectoral approach always in the beginning that will work at micro level, at meso level also to build capacities of partners, and at a macro level also to influence policy dialogue. But inclusiveness, I think, is key. Listen to the different people and actors involved to see, okay, where are their particular needs. So resilient food systems also are a key element for GIZ's development, policy and active work also. And now we are in a transition. For example, we know that Stefan Schmitz has been there at BMZ side at that time when we were talking about the one world, no hunger concept also. And I think that translates relatively clear also where we see our role. So I would stop here also, because there are probably many more things that we would like to discuss. Thank you.
Absolutely. There is the question of the agro and food companies that I would like to give to the panel, because it's been liked by several participants in the audience, and there's a lot of other questions. So let's look at them right away and see how we can cover this interest. The largest financial beneficiaries of crop biodiversity are agro-food companies. How can we convince them to do more to save crop diversity? Because we've talked about, only a small number of crops actually being used for the kind of, food that we are used to consume, but there's lots more out there, you already mentioned. So who would take this thread up, and then we can see if there are additions on the panel. How can they contribute? Do we hope that they will do it voluntarily, or do we need another mechanism?
I know that we had a short discussion before we started.
Okay, well,
Exactly.
let's take this on the panel. If you've already discussed this, let's hear you. Share it.
Well, there is some models, but they are much too few. That's certainly true. But on cocoa, for instance, there is a PPP approach whereby the big companies, Mars and others, are investing straight in the conservation in Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, in supporting labor, in supporting the country, but also then the labor, the people themselves, the farmers growing the cocoa. And this is kind of, for them, also a marketing approach, yes, and it's still too little, because the labor conditions are not really changing, so even that needs to be much more intense. But this, taking as a model, would mean we need to actually see how can we transfer this to also other crops and maybe also other food systems, because I can't see that this will happen for rice, for wheat separately. Yeah, for these crops like coffee, we have similar examples with coffee in Ethiopia and so forth. That may happen. Yeah, there is a big bulk of money and very concentrated companies that really invest there. But the real situation, it's not always agro-food companies as, oh, this is only Unilever or Nestle. It's a large number of companies, and so yeah, by and large, it's a kind of a voluntary invitation to them to share also their benefits. We have heard an announcement in New Delhi for the plant treaty negotiations. There was an announcement of a share, but still too little. And yeah, maybe it's kind of also an approach to think for the future how much stronger to involve them, to get them involved. We had maybe a preparatory step as, say, the German Agricultural Agency and Ministry when we conducted a national dialogue on the United Nations Food Systems dialogue during the past year. We had one of the focus areas where we looked into was on the involvement of trade and the companies in the terms of trade. And so for the first time, and there is a real change, there is a step change, really, like Joachim von Baum was saying. In the past, they were just not willing to talk to us. And now they realize, no, the times have changed, and if we really want to have a transformation of the food systems, they are an extremely important partner. So they engaged in the dialogue, and we had a workshop, and they are open. And we are now talking about what kind of labeling do we need, and how can we put standards behind the label maybe to come at the EU level, at least in Europe. So there is something ongoing, and then, of course, the question is how can that money that is maybe created through this approach being rechanneled into the people that really need it. I'm completely with you, but the question on who is the guardian of biodiversity or the crop diversity, the in situ on-farm approach vis-à-vis the ex situ, if you really want to be firm, we need to safeguard also the gene banks, the ex situ side, to really be sure that this is not going to be lost. Yeah, so it's not really to be convincing, but yeah, at least some models are there.
Something to add to the prior conversation, and then Professor Hornich?
Yeah. I may add something also, and then you can see in which direction we want to go, because I would like to bring there again sort of that change in consumer patterns, which is very important to the sort of, when you want to talk about agro-food systems in companies also, yes, they're selling to consumers. The personal story that I want to know, the deputy mayor has already gone also, personal story also, when we employed our a person also in Ghana also to help us in the household of whom we knew before, and she had a catering company in the meantime established since our 2 visits to Ghana also. And then I asked her also, yes, but so what can you afford to whatever help us out also, and what is your catering actually doing? And she said, okay, she's catering for business people in banks and others. On Monday they won't have this, Wednesday, Tuesday this one, Wednesday this. So, but 3 times a week rice, and I hear her saying, the people eat too much rice. And that just indicates also sort of where consumption diversity got lost and is very channeled toward very easy, convenient food patterns also that doesn't help us also to convince agro-food industries also to offer more diverse foods, because the consumer themselves in the urban situation has asked for very single-minded diets also. So I think that's
suitable that we have the potatoes behind us for a German audience, you know, because we probably eat too much of this, you know.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that is something that we need to bear in mind also. And again, from a personal experience, also from my previous posting in Cameroon, we have been supporting indigenous people in the transformation of indigenous foods also that are made for the local markets. So it's not only agro-food companies who are benefiting also, but we can do our share as a development corporation also to whatever preserve this one, because the Bar people in the forests of Cameroon, they consider them as custodians of biodiversity, but they also need to earn a living, and that is something where we actually need to come into and assist them. So that's maybe as a reaction.
You wanted to add something, or?
Well, I think it's just important to keep in mind that within the biodiversity-related policy making, we have the same issue as with regard to climate policy making, and I think was mentioned before already. We also here see the immense need to mobilize private capital, but that only works through a near to voluntary sort of means. Then we have the PPP approaches, of which we know that some work and many also don't really work. Yeah. Why? There is again and again differing logics being criticized that don't seem to entirely come together. And then that leaves us with, of course, attempts to change consumption behavior and build up pressures through doing this, as well as on the national level then, or also on the regional levels, depending on regional body organizations, regulatory means. No? And I think that's sort of the three elements that have, or that elements is not the correct word, but the three levers that through which change can be triggered there.
There's one question that seems to be quite popular or relevant for the audience. How can we effectively promote the neglected and underutilized species in a food system where quantity is favored over quality? I think Professor von Braun also mentioned that unhealthy, non-nutritious food is cheaper than sustainable and healthy food. So any ideas other than that we, of course, all eat, very healthy and sustainable food here on the panel because we are role models, but where's the leverage? I'm just saying. I'm not going to ask what you guys had for lunch today, so let me stick with this image here. But where's the leverage that we actually, rather than, putting guilt on people for eating a way they do because it's affordable and it's available, how can we make it a win-win solution for crop diversity, better agriculture and better nutrition in this part of the world? Because I think we play an important role when it comes to these questions. And so far we've had a discussion of, Veggie Day, I don't want my freedom taken away from me. It's sort of a non-constructive discussion sometimes. How can we make it more constructive, taking all this into account?
Well, on the underutilized species, that is an ongoing debate since, my professional lifetime probably. 30, 40 years. And so there had been, and there are still, initiatives trying to get out of this dilemma. We have 7,000 cultivated species that we know, and we use a fraction from these. No? And so what is the bulk of the others? We know the users, but they're not appearing on the market at a larger scale. So we had approaches also in development cooperation policies to say, okay, we single some of them out, maybe the ones that just have disappeared from the bigger markets, and try to work through the whole value chain. It means really starting from the seed, from the genetic resource, up to the consumer, and we need to pull all the strings at the same time to create demand, and then at the same time have sufficient capable varieties to be developed for the farmers to produce. And this is the crop approach. And the crop approach, it works here and there, the quinoa example, and we have a few of them, but if you look back into the food systems are much more diverse. They have to be much more diverse. So we thought maybe this crop approach is not the real one. So maybe then, and the Trust and FAO and others have started these kind of public awareness approaches. So really talk about this, tell stories, tell very good stories, and people might be convinced then to say, oh yeah, I tried that one out. And so we need to probably address it to the youth, the young generation. They need to test, they need to be curious, they are curious, but they need to be told these stories, and they will be the ambassadors for the future. So it's not easy, and so we need rather a systems approach instead of a crop approach. That's for sure.
I've heard you.
I'm a bit hopeful at that point, at least in our markets here. When you see how much debate is about superfood and healthy food and nutrition and so on, will that change, is my question, will that change the food systems across the globe? Or would we have to trickle down to other continents as well, where we have this very elite kind of debate of good food. I saw that in China, I saw it in India and so on. But it's not trickled down to let's say, the masses of people who needs to take calories in daily calories. So this is still, let's say, in the side of many people, that they not go hungry, they not look at what kind of effects would it have if they only take in stable food. So when you're saying we need this awareness, we need to come back to already known but forgotten knowledges, we really need to look not only in the markets here, we need to look in the markets everywhere. And my question is, I've posed these questions already, but can there be economic incentives to diversify? Because we had economic incentives to diversify. There were strong economic reasons to shrink the number of foods which we had. So can we reverse this logic and make it cheaper, make it economic attractive, not only to companies, but also to small-scale farmers, a big topic which I'm, very close to. And can we help not only the consumer, but also the producer to find economic incentives? Because if I get the right value for my food, which I'm producing, I might go for higher value food if I have consumers, and so on. So I don't want, awareness is one thing, but you have to afford not only the awareness, but also to afford your diet. And if it's too high in price, it will not work in the long run. So I think we have to really include this question in our thinking.
Yeah, I would like to come in regarding the smallholders and bring in the seasonal variability of hunger. Yeah, I think that's a very important aspect to keep in mind, that of course the hunger that we observe in amongst smallholders takes place during certain times of the year. And it has a lot to do with storage capacities, also with diversity of crops, and with preservation and processing capacities. And that, again, of course, has a lot to do with our extension service or advisory, agricultural and also in fisheries advisory systems that are in place, that are organized very differently in different country contexts, sometimes state-based, sometimes attached to universities, sometimes donor financed, sometimes market-driven, depending on which crop is being targeted, for instance, or which seeds, etc. But that's also an important leverage, and a leverage point or lever that, in my view, is actually underexplored, also especially in those areas of agricultural production or of food systems in general, where, for instance, female smallholders take on a leading role. And we, of course, look at who are the extensionists involved in the advisory activities and what are their additional roles. For instance, in some countries, agricultural advisors also collect taxes, which, of course, then mixes giving advice with being the prolonged arm of the state. Yeah? That mixes then logics in many ways that puts the smallholder at risk, at a certain type of risk again, and creates a situation where taking up that advice becomes difficult, or at least more difficult. So just to add to the conversation, because I think the seasonal variability of hunger closely links, of course, with questions of crop diversity, of bringing in seeds that can be planted earlier, which means that they can be also partly harvested earlier before the heavy rains start again, before destructive type of climate change-induced weather patterns start. And there is a lot of movement and a lot of space for bringing in research and development and merging it with local expertise and innovation systems on the ground.
I would still like to add something also, not to the question was a bit, you mentioned the potatoes and what we are doing here also, so I'm not feeling sort of position to answer that part of the question, but again, sort of part of the question also about consumption and patterns and mindsets also in developing countries. For two aspects, 2 weeks ago at the Tropentag also, in Prague also, was listening, for example, to a presentation from a social enterprise in Niger also who is promoting actually those forgotten foods. Now, the very important element also is that when they talk about this fruit de cueillette, sort of those fruits that are diverse and bring a lot of nutritional value to the diet, they have the notion of hunger foods. People in African countries also that I have met, they also want to be modern. That's why they eat white bread, for example, whether that is good for their nutrition or not also. So I think there's sort of, and when we did farmer business school training, which has an important element on nutrition also, and you have asked also, why is the person who is producing food going hungry to bed? Yes. When we talked about the nutritional value of the different crops a family household produces, people sell beans to buy meat. Okay, then you ask, okay, do you know that you can get the self-protein also intake from eating your beans, probably 10 times as much as selling them and then buying meat or fish instead? So I think when we talk about consumption patterns also, it is also that there are mindsets of people in the countries that we work also that we would need to address also. So it is that notion of hunger food that those diverse crops and neglected crops have, and the notion I want to be modern, and that's why I'm eating the rice that I've been mentioning before. So that multi-level approach working at micro level, at meso level also, that advisors have the capacity actually to provide advice needed, and policy advisory services to influence framework conditions is very important. And in the meantime, we still need to protect crop or whatever biodiversity in situ and ex situ, support gene banks and do whatever, promote nature-based solutions also in the field. And they are part of GIZ's portfolio.
It sort of leads to the question that I've been reading. How does the German government support crop diversity conservation, and where does it see its money having the most impact? Since you are working with German government money, I think you're the first person to answer that question.
Sort of, yeah. Of course, I could make the answer relatively easy also than referring to Professor Brown's presentation also, where do we see most impact? And I'm a little bit biased because I'm working for a fund for international agricultural research. So I think that investment there makes a lot of sense. Nonetheless, also the differentiation between short, medium, and long-term solutions is required. And of course, GIZ works in social security and protection systems, which may be needed also because if you don't invest in them also, then people cut down forests and you cut down trees for firewood and others because they're in a very desperate situation, and then stomach comes before crop diversity also. So we need to invest in short-term solutions to ease the living conditions in a specific context, but also to support framework conditions to be set right by politicians also, and to build capacities of people to respond. So therefore, I would say also there's not a single measure also that needs to be supported also. You need to adapt your response to different situations. And if there's something that we learned also is that we are working in that VUCA world also, vulnerable and unforeseen and very volatile environments also. And then I think we need to be clear that we need to be very reactive and listening to people's needs.
May I add?
Absolutely.
To that, because I think there is not the one single approach of the German government, and since I've worked for the German government, I know a little bit about it. And I would like to come in with a example which I really liked and which I think can be a role model. The government of Andhra Pradesh, one of the states in India, decided to take up a loan from the German government on the tune of 200 million euros to bring 5 million small-scale farmers, here again my small-scale farmers, to agroecological approaches. And I was wondering why a government, a state government within India, should take up such a huge loan to do that. And what is the benefit? It's very obviously for those people being targeted, but why do they take credit and loans for that? And they said it's very simple. First of all, we have more resilience. Secondly, we bring down our expenditures. How that? They don't need to have so much on social security measures. They save on subsidies for fertilizers and others. So it's economic. And here you have a change. I mean, if you do that in one state with 5 million people, this is a game changer, right? And here you hit many questions with one stick, right? So, and as you said, it's not the question of money. Yeah, they are ready to take up loans for that because it's economic. And because it gives us crop diversity, and because it gives us resilience. Can we replicate such things?
Are the results as good as your excitement about this approach?
Can't say, because it started.
It started, okay.
It started, but it started because they had evidence. It was not built on let's say, a calculation on the table. They had made evidence. And then only if you have evidence, you get people to take such bold decisions. It's a long way to come to this point, right? And yeah, I'm excited about it. This is true, because the exciting thing is its scale. We don't have so many approaches where you really come to scale. And we need to scale up fast. We can do here and this project and this one, and we can look for Spitzbergen that it's not getting watered and so on, and 10 millions here and there. But how do we scale up? And this is, I think, a question which we really have to think about. We need to be fast and to be on scale.
Frank?
On that point, on the scaling, the German government is not the German government. We talk about BMZ, we have just heard about BMZ. For the Agriculture Ministry, we have kind of a complementary approach. We use more the multilateral channels through the FAO and others. And here we can scale. That means, so we enable the FAO with some model projects in some partner countries, sometimes also in multilateral projects, where we try to be one of the funders or the donors. And then we can showcase in some countries, it works maybe this way and that way. And so it can be taken up by other countries. But then the coordination and, say, the dissemination of these success stories is given as a task to FAO. And therefore, we also need to acknowledge Germany is Germany, and we are just a small country, maybe not completely unimportant, but we should not exaggerate. Yeah? We can't really improve the whole world. We can just do our share, and we need to see what is our share, what is our role, where do we have also the expertise, what is to be brought into the overall global picture. And I think we have good cases where we try to also involve our scientists, our researchers, our agencies, and so forth with our knowledge. And then we are back to extension service knowledge systems and so forth. And we are trying to fund also exactly these kind of projects. Yeah, so knowledge transfer projects and so forth.
I had a signal from you.
Yeah, thanks. And I think it fits quite well. I mean, into this discussion of what are the big wheels to structurally push forward transformational processes. And of course, the multilateral level is important. The bilateral that can be scaled is important. And I just want to bring in the G20. I was recently at the Think 20 summit in Bali, which is basically the summit where the think tank community comes together in order to support the G20. And what struck me was that there was a very strong sort of southernized global governance spirit that influenced many of the discussions, and that originates from the situation that Indonesia is holding the G20 presidency this year, but India next year, followed by South Africa, Brazil. So 4 years of the G20 in clearly southern hands, so to say, with the presidency. And that spirit is motivating and it's very positive, but at the same time, it went hand in hand with quite a discussion on what type of leadership should unfold, and what kind of leadership the think tank community of the G20 should also sort of support and foster. And I mean, the CGIAR system was mentioned several times, and of course that's important system, and you've mentioned it as well, for research and development in the field. And at the same time, I think it's also very clear that within the spirit of the music is playing in the G20 and the music is playing in the big transition economies, it's clear that the investments into research and development in such important fields such as agrobiodiversity and crop diversity has to also be brought up and increased by a number of large transition economies, and actually fast. We have this situation that we have some that are heavily investing, China for instance, but we also have the situation that others invest hardly anything into research and development. Indonesia is at 0.2% of the gross national product. So very, very little attention being placed or emphasis being placed on investing into this research and development infrastructure, one might say, on an international level, also out of the big transition economies. And I think there it's important that also Germany plays a role in fostering a dialogue on the international level to raise awareness of the importance of research and development being a transregional, transnational exercise that requires always the local fit in the solutions that are being developed. But for doing so, we also need a transnational and multilateral, one could say, financing mechanism.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Is that an addition or
No,
loud thinking?
Just support.
Just support, okay. Just wanted to make sure.
A wonderful, if you allow me just one sentence, if you see a wonderful example with Brazil. Brazil 20, 30 years ago was negotiating in our fora CBD or plant treaty very, very differently to nowadays. They invested a lot into Embrapa. Embrapa is a research giant today, and with this and this knowledge, they have very different intention now with their negotiations. They want international cooperation in research projects, in cooperating on a fair, eye-level partnership, and that was not the case 30 years ago. They were just asking for money, and that is gone. Yeah, so you see what an impact can be developed just by investing in research, not only projects, but really infrastructure.
Capacity building.
Yes.
Yeah. Before we go into some of the probably more difficult questions, there's one that I think might be easily answered, because I think I even know the answer from researching for this. Can we bring extinct varieties back to life when we're talking about crop varieties? Is that easy or difficult to answer? Is it possible?
I don't think there's Jurassic Park.
Well, the question is, what is a variety? In terms of variety, it's probably a very technical discussion. I don't know, you want to start that now? If you talk about land races that had been developed over decades or maybe even centuries in some parts of the world, if they are lost as land races, it's much more complicated. You will not get it back. Varieties today, usually you have a breeder in the background, and if they still know the pedigree, how they developed that, you might recreate it if you still have the origins and the lines to be used to develop that variety. But I don't know whether that question was really meant in this direction.
But an example from Peru that I've seen also personally also that helps also. That is where we have cryopreservation in gene banks, which we support. When land races have been lost with the farmers actually came back to SIP potato gene bank also and asking, do you still have some of those ones in store? And they had, and then it has been sort of reintroduced again to the farming community also, because there are some very local varieties. And then, of course, if for any reason these can be lost also, then it is good to have a backup copy somewhere. So they are not extinct, because you have them in a gene bank also, but of course that's why the importance of that conservation measures is there.
Okay, so we stressed Stefan's point again, better protect now and make sure that they're well protected, so they don't become extinct.
Yeah.
All right, so that was fairly easy, even though it was more complicated than I thought it was. But thank you, because one person wanted to know this, and there was some interest from other people for this question. The public attention is the question that interests many people here. I'm eager to learn how we can bring the topic of crop diversity to public attention. Would you be open for a multi-stakeholder initiative? You mean the people on this panel or everyone in this room? Two questions, but the public attention, I mean, there's quite public attention for this evening, so there is, interest in the issue of crop diversity. But what's, from your professional research and other background, is it high enough on the agenda?
No.
And if not, how can we raise it? Or how, not we, but maybe how could it be raised?
He already said no.
No, you said no.
No, it's not high enough.
Yeah, right.
So we see the Food Forever initiative, for instance, that were approaches where we tried it. And what I said before, an approach could be this kind of storytelling. We know from the US, North America, some initiatives, they try on particular crops exactly a particular key person. Usually you have a key person, a lady or a man, farmer, whatever. They tell you a story about diversification, usually on a particular crop or land race or whatever, and that is convincing. And that might lead to a situation to convince people, oh yeah, that sounds reasonable. But it needs much, much more, really. And the hope, my hope in the future anyway, is with the young women, because the young women are probably the game changer. It was your word, but I do believe they're much earlier open for a change, for trying something out. We know from research they're much earlier more flexible than young men. And so we see also the Fridays for Futures and so forth. How many young women are there? Yeah, so, and they are really a driving force. They can become a driving force. And so if we can have something like Food Forever as an approach, also addressing particular target groups as ambassadors then to convey the message again, that might lead to a situation where we have much more really into the real society.
Any other thoughts on how to get more attention outside of our community? Because I think we're preaching to the already converted here.
Yeah.
Well, maybe just to briefly come in. I mean, of course, we are competing at the moment with quite a number of pressing topics, no, globally speaking. And I think that has to be kept in mind. One very strong narrative that is not only a narrative, unfortunately, but the hard truth is the one of the multiple crises that are unfolding and that are not racing each other, but are unfolding at the same time and developing substantial dynamics between them. I think it's important to also link the crop diversity and agrobiodiversity discussions into that discussion, and that's already being done, of course. Yeah? The resilience terminology has shaped also the discussion here on the panel, the idea to how do we invest into the resilience of societies and with this of food systems is a discussion that is shaping policy making at quite a number of levels. But also that is only a bubble, of course. And sort of thinking about it out of a system perspective, of course, then it becomes relevant to break out of these system bubbles and think about how to engage the media, how to engage the social media, how to engage younger generational groups in society. But I think it's also there important to stay realistic and not expect science or research to do the transfer, so to say, and also not expect public offices to fully do that, but rather here really think about PPPs and with the media and with the social media enterprises, because they are professional in shaping public discourse.
One last question, specific recommendations for the crop trust. I think Stefan and his team are also hoping to hear things to improve their work, maybe to raise more awareness, maybe ideas that you haven't had. So if there's anything, either now or later on during the reception, if you have like the one brilliant thought, don't be shy to share it. Don't you be shy to share it. I think it's time for our break. We'll have a 15-minute break to do some rearranging, and then we'll hear some research perspectives from Vaughan researchers that we've invited to listen in on this discussion and share what they heard, what they reflected on, also what their institutions can add to the conversation and maybe also to the common cause of crop diversity. So thank you very much so far. See you again in 15 minutes. Don't leave the building. There's food and drinks. If you stay, there's food and drinks later. That will get you, doesn't it? It always gets me. So please.
Diverse food.
Let's see, like almost extinct crop. We'll see. They'll surprise us, I'm pretty sure. See you in a little while.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back. Welcome back. Can I convince you to take your seats so we can continue? That would be lovely. As already mentioned, after this round of conversation, you will have a chance to network and enjoy the lovely food and drinks upstairs. I've been told it's all vegan and vegetarian, diversity in crop, and diversity in cold refreshments. Thank you for staying with us. It looks like we're almost ready to continue. One more thing, all right. The last mile of the official part. I mentioned earlier that we invited 4 experts from the University of Bonn, and I'll welcome them on the stage now. And this time I'm going by alphabetical order from the back. Professor Dr. Maximilian Weigand, Director of the Botanic Gardens of the University of Bonn. Welcome. Please join me on my left. This is your team. Thank you. Professor Dr. Lisa Freudenberger, Center for Development Research. Welcome. Professor Dr. Thomas Döring, Agroecology and Organic Farming. Welcome. And Professor Dr. Jan Börner, Economics of Sustainable Land Use and Bioeconomy. Welcome. I have same questions for all of you, but I'll start with you, Professor Weigand. What specific role does crop diversity play in your work as a researcher and university lecturer?
Well, my primary interaction with crop diversity is that we've got what we say is Central Europe's largest useful plant collection at Bonn University Botanic Gardens in a separate part of the garden. And one of the focal points of that collection for the last 20 years, so long before I became director, has been collecting land races of locally, especially vegetables. And we're now starting also doing some conservation of fruit varieties from the regional area. So that's not so much a research focus, but it's a focus of work, certainly. And the interesting part about it is that it's food diversity, crop diversity, regional varieties is something that immediately captures the public's attention. Because it's an unknown part of local identity, essentially. And I think when we talk about the whole issue, how do we engage people into the whole topic, I think that is a crucial point, that it's a part of the identity people don't know about. It's the cultural heritage of the region, and if they're confronted with it, they have an immediate emotional connection with it. Independent of its nutritional value and whatever, there is an immediate emotional connection. That's what marketing usually uses extensively for all kinds of crop products, and that's something that we are very, very poor in using for promoting crop diversity, actually.
What are some of the reactions when people come
everybody
visit?
wants to have it. They want to know where they
like
can
the seedling.
They want to have the seed if we produce seed and we sell them on the spring market of the city of Bonn, but also at the Herbstmarkt im Nutzpflanzengarten, which is going to take place this Sunday. Please come, all of you.
What times? Opening hours?
All day.
All
Sunday.
day. Okay. Bring some money and a bag. And
Yeah,
then come.
exactly. And there we sell, for instance, seeds and stuff like that, and people immediately buy it. But they would also like to buy the produce, which we, of course, don't produce because we're not an agricultural company, but we are actually just a research and teaching collection. So people would like to buy it. Well, how that would possibly translate into commercially viable options, I can't tell you because I'm a botanist, but maybe somebody here can work it out.
We have a reception. Maybe there's going to be a startup idea later tonight.
Good.
We have heard many perspectives, problem analysis and some policy issues earlier on crop diversity and food security. From your vantage point, are there any important aspects that we have not mentioned earlier that you would like now to add?
I think I'd come back to the identity issue. That the point was made that sometimes traditional foods are considered as famine foods, and that's actually just a bad word for sustainability and self-sufficiency. It means that you have something to eat the year round. And I think you've got to turn that argument onto its head. It's the way in which people are able to feed themselves throughout the year from a given region without importing the Savoy cabbages from Turkey and the apples from New Zealand. So I think you have to turn that argument onto its head, and then it suddenly makes sense.
Plant breeding today, we can use many modern methods. We didn't really talk a lot about the technologies that we can use to target specific characteristics and qualities of crops, but doesn't this ability make the question of diversity of crop sort of obsolete at some point?
Well, I think plant breeding works with a fax machine, and natural selection works with a quantum computer. So we've got this tremendous diversity, these tremendously different genes working at different levels in often genetically heterogeneous cultivar populations. And you oppose that to something that's tailor-made, monoclonal, genetically identical. And I think if you want to go towards sustainably feeding the world, then we need this broad genetic basis, and that can't be replaced by man-made, manufactured, robotic plants of 10 zillion genetically identical individuals, because that is always going to be susceptible to unforeseeable climate events, to particular pathogens or stuff like that. So I do not think that this is the way to go.
Mm-hmm. Where do you see a fundamental need for further research? We talked a little bit about research earlier too. Where can it contribute to solving some of the problems that we only barely covered? I know it's a broad subject. And do you see a concrete role for yourself or for your Vaughan Institute, the Botanic Gardens?
I do think that globally our documentation and preservation of especially land races and traditional crops is still highly unsatisfactory. I know there has been tremendous pilot work, especially by the Crop Trust, to increase our knowledge of that. But I know that there are still huge knowledge gaps, even in the Rhineland, where we know that a large proportion of the old races has been lost. And we also assume that many of them are still around, but we do not have either the expertise nor the manpower to locate them. So they're probably still there on farms in private gardens and stuff like that. But doing the basic research of finding out, firstly, who still holds these things, and secondly, what are they, actually tracing them back to catalogues and descriptions. That is one part where I can see, as a taxonomist by training, I can see a real research need, and also the potential of contributing as a botanical garden, not only in identifying and keeping these things, but also interacting, of course, with Frau Gura is here, who is I think, still leading the FEN. So there's an interaction also with NGOs there, and of course with the Crop Trust that's conceivable.
Thank you. Professor Lisa Freudenberger, Center for Development Research. What specifically do you do at the center?
So at the Center for Development Research, we're interested in sustainable development and strategies basically for the sustainable development. And our research focus is in the global south. So mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Latin America as well as Asia. And we do research on sustainable development from different dimensions, including natural perspective, but also social and economic perspectives. And in my specific work, we are looking at land use, and we're looking at trade-offs and synergies when it comes to the implementation of the sustainable development goals. We know that land is a limited resource, and there are increasing demands on land in terms of food production, in terms of energy production, but also for biodiversity conservation. And so what we are looking at are the different strategies that exist, and other strategies that might not yet exist but can be developed to utilize the synergies, and also to avoid these pathways that have maybe not that benefit maybe one sustainability dimension, but not necessarily another one.
What role does crop diversity play in your work?
Yeah, so the trade-offs between food production and biodiversity conservation is obviously a huge one that many people are very much aware of. And diversification, we heard nature-based solutions are necessary to kind of to change our food system. And diversification is the biggest nature-based solution that we are having. Diversification is all around us when we look at ecosystems. And the idea of nature-based solutions is to use natural principles and use them to make us fit for future challenges, including the climate change, including future uncertainties, the VUCA world, as we heard before. And so diversification is one of the strategies that we're also looking at in my research group as a potential to kind of utilize the synergies between biodiversity conservation and food production on the farm and also increasing the income to the farmer.
And you followed the earlier discussion. Is there any aspect that we didn't mention or something that you would like to add to the conversation?
Yeah, so I like the point that Anna-Katharina Hornich made that, it's the food crisis we are in is actually a distribution problem. There is enough food on this planet, and there will also be enough in the future if we are also looking at how we are consuming. And I think that we always have to remember this when we are talking about new technologies and all these things. And so there is actually enough food that is being produced, and we can also produce enough food sustainably. The problem is that the food or all the resources we are consuming, they come with certain externalities, and these externalities, they are not necessarily happening where we are living. So we're importing food from elsewhere, and that then has an impact there. So we're exporting basically the effects. And that leads to a situation where we are being decoupled from what our consumer behavior actually has in terms of impact. So I think what we need are basically policies and measures and maybe bold strategies like India put into place that really change the system we're in, because I think it's not about changing a little bit here or a little bit there. It's really a lot of things would have to change to make our food consumption or food systems really sustainable. And I think we need really some bold policymakers and as well as social actors to do that, yes.
And the question about being able to breed plants today using modern technology and, maybe making diversity obsolete. What's your answer?
So I like the picture of the fax machine and the quantum computer. Of course, you could say, now we can do everything technically. The problem, I think, is also that we have, at the moment, a system where the markets and basically lead to a situation that, because it's economically more viable, all farmers then, basically jump on this new crop, which is, much better in terms of, drought resistance or something like this. And for a moment, that's great, but of course, this increases then the vulnerability of the overall system. We see in nature that more diverse systems are more resilient against natural catastrophes. They build up quicker after something has happened, like a big fire or something like this. So why don't we use this inherent capacities of diversification to make our food systems more resilient?
Where do you see need for further research on what could you contribute or your institute, your colleagues contribute?
Yeah, I think this whole question of, how does a future look like? How can a future look like where not only the people in Germany, in Europe, and the northern part of our world are living a good life, but the whole world can actually lead a good life. And bringing these different perspectives and dimensions together, I think this is where the Center for Development Research really can make a great contribution, because we are working very closely with people from the Global South, and we are having a lot of doctoral students that are coming from there and are going back again, and I think this is where we can make a really great contribution to that.
Thank you. You're getting ready. Professor Dr. Thomas Döring, Agroecology and Organic Farming.
That's right, yes.
This time it worked. What do you do?
So what we're looking at is relatively similar to what Lisa just described. We're concentrating on diversification, crop diversification, but more in, let's say, the home context of this country and other European countries. So trying to basically minimize the trade-offs between nature conservation and crop production. And there are a few examples where crop diversity can actually help to achieve such a minimization of trade-off, to find some synergies, for example, by using minor crops such as poppy or fennel that attract insects and help associated biodiversity, but at the same time also generate an income for the farmer, a very good income. So that is one of our focus areas. And also I'd like to mention teaching, because that is also very important and has, I think, also been mentioned here as a basis for actually building the next generation of crop diversity enthusiasts.
Mm-hmm. We need excitement. What are maybe some additions to the prior conversation on the panel that you would like to make?
Yes, one point I've already just mentioned is the associated biodiversity. I think that hasn't been mentioned so far, and I think it cannot be isolated from crop diversity. So all the insects, all the functional diversity, the pollinators, the pest regulators, the beneficial insects, and all the other organisms that help to run agriculture and agricultural systems, they are very important. And as we go deeper into the soil, for example, we discover that actually the crop is, of course, not alone, but has a rhizosphere which is very much populated with lots of different organisms. And this diversity also belongs to the crop and it needs to be thought in combination with the diversity that we've got there. So that, I think, is very important and makes it, I think, however, very difficult to actually preserve that. But at the same time, it calls for basically in situ conservation, because otherwise, not actually going to preserve that combined diversity.
Also the same question about being able to breed, using modern methods, technology. Could that make up for, putting so much effort into conserving crop diversity?
Yeah, you mentioned modern technologies, and that could be many things.
The fax machine, yes.
So that's the, let's say, that's avoiding the conflicts that are in some of the terms, Mm-hmm. But what I really think is that most of the current and very recent technologies do have a complementary role to play. And of course, plant breeding is based on the diversity. It does not function in isolation from the crop diversity that we need to preserve. It's only taking part of this. And I think, yes, it can in some cases be complementary in terms of adding interesting functions, but there is also a caveat, because many of the very important functions, such as drought tolerance, you mentioned that, they are multi-genetic or are dependent on many different genes playing together, and that means that it's a long way for breeding to actually go there. And I think then we probably have at least an alternative, very good approach by using the diversity at the field level. And perhaps one last point on this is that both modern technologies in plant breeding and more traditional plant breeding, conventional plant breeding methods have focused almost exclusively on monocultures, so-called monocultures. Basically, very simplified agroecosystems where we grow one crop. You showed, I think there was this nice picture from Phenob where you just showed the sugar beet field and the robot, yeah? So it's just sugar beet. I don't know. I find this quite boring. Yeah. So although I'm part of this project. Yeah. But I find much more interesting is to bring different crops together and then breed for that diversity. Yeah. Breed for agroforestry systems, breed for mixtures and so on. But this is very, very complicated, and we are only at the beginning at the moment with this. But it, I think, has a great potential for solving, on bringing different levels of diversity together.
Where do you see a need for further research, and how could your team contribute?
Yeah, I think we've had this discussion already before. I would say research is second, yeah, because there's the primacy of practice and of politics. So when I do research projects and then I think about the European agricultural policy, I get very sad. And I think that there's not much that we can, as researcher, can achieve when the political decisions that really have impact on a large area if they're taken in the wrong direction. And there was already some idea to increase crop diversity at the farm level, to diversify rotations, but there's been, say, resistance to that idea, and I think it was not courageous enough, yeah, to actually bring up that diversity there. And the 10% non-cropped area have been mentioned in the presentation. We are currently at 4%, and this has generated a very large resistance in the farmers' community. Also for understandable reasons, we need to actually help, of course, but I think we can, with small research projects or even large research projects, we cannot achieve a lot if decisions are taken in the wrong direction at that level. And we need to pressurize to get that into the right direction. And perhaps just one point, when you ask me where could perhaps research bring out something that is really important, I think legumes are important. Legumes have a very great role to play in terms of, because they are relevant for the system, yeah, in terms of reducing the need or the consumption of meat, to add more plant-based protein, but also to add more nitrogen, plant-based nitrogen into the system for nitrogen fixation. But we've got more than 600 maize varieties in Germany and only a dozen or so faba bean varieties. So this is the contrast. Yeah? So we need more, more enthusiasm there. Again.
Thank you very much. Professor Dr. Jan Börner, Economics of Sustainable Land Use and Bioeconomy. What do you do specifically?
Yeah, so first of all, I think I have to admit that I'm probably the panel member that knows the least about biodiversity here. So I'm a social scientist, but I'm dealing with sustainable land use. So what we do is basically taking for granted what you tell us, and then work with this. Yeah? That applies to data, but also to things about what the specific role of biodiversity might be in a field or in the landscape or in an ecosystem. And then we do things like, so some of us, I'm not counting myself to that part of our crowd, is dedicating a lot of time to valuing the contribution of biodiversity, so putting monetary values to aspects of biodiversity. Others are looking into, well, what would it cost to maintain biodiversity at certain levels? Or how do we induce decision makers, be it consumers or producers, to behave in such a way that biodiversity is conserved or dietary diversity increases and things like that. And lastly, we look into what kind of policy mechanisms are effective and also cost effective, so not just whether they work, but also how much they cost, how efficient they are in achieving these goals. And I think, so in that sense, I think we are very complementary here, so we are basically, we can inform each other, but first of all, I need to know more about biodiversity to be actually able to use my tools. Yeah.
So if I asked you what role does crop diversity play in your work, what would the answer be?
So first of all, it is, let's say, if I hear that crop diversity has a certain role to play in a field to maintain certain functions, then the question is, of course, the first question I would ask is, why don't farmers maintain diversity at certain levels, right? And then think about the reasons. And so it's an outcome of all sorts of behavioral and policy processes. So that would be one aspect of it. We are actually doing some work together with Thomas in a project called Phenotype that was mentioned before, where we look at what would be the contribution of technology to increasing crop diversity. So it's also kind of thinking about how you can improve it. And lastly, how you can learn from it. And this is the bioeconomy part in the denomination there. So bioeconomy also has many different followers. Some of them are thinking of maximizing biomass produced on monocultures, and others are thinking about how to learn from nature, more in the sense of what Lisa just mentioned. And I would also count me more to the latter. So in terms of how can we learn from nature in terms of how we work agriculture, how we work even our economy in terms of making it more circular.
Would you like to share or add something to our further discussion? Maybe something you observed from a more outsider perspective?
Well, nothing completely new, but I think we had a discussion about how to increase both dietary diversity and crop diversity. And I think we had a lot of examples from developing countries and a lot of examples from, maybe not so many from our world. But I think there's important distinction to be made. So if you manage to increase hunger for more diverse diets in developing countries where people produce their own food, you make easily also contribution to making the fields more biodiverse. But if you do this in our world, you can easily make your diet more diverse without having any effect on the crops, which we are in a totally labor divided world. So that gets me to think about the instruments we need to make this happen. And we talked about breeding, and of course breeders breed crops for people who want to maximize their income from agriculture. Now, Joachim von Braun told us it's not only about the cost of producing the food, it's also about the costs of actually the cost the food production implies for society. So as an economist, I would say we need to somehow internalize these costs, which will make food more expensive. It will make it will increase the quality, but it also means we're going to exclude many people from access to food unless we find other mechanisms. So what is the combination of instruments that we need to create the incentives to make crops more, let's say, to promote the type of diversity we want to see in fields and landscapes. And I would probably go beyond fields because I think we need to look at the whole thing and the trees and the forests and bring it all together. But that's, I think, the question we have to ask. And there, my colleagues always tell me when we discuss this, well, we don't know enough about the functions of biodiversity. So where should we start? Which are the key functions we need to maintain for these impacts to be lower? And so I think that's something, I'm anticipating your next question on what the research needs are, I think we should start there. But let me just
Go ahead, I've asked it 3 times, so you know the drill.
Just let me say one thing. I think we have environmental policy is not being used in the way it could be used. So if you look into environmental policy, it's all about regulation. Yeah? It's sort of, we wait until a problem occurs, and then we regulate. Yeah? But environmental policy could do more, and there are ideas about, incentivizing behavior beyond what the law is asking for. I think regulation is needed to some extent, and we see that if you look into how nitrogen use is regulated, that does have an effect on how agriculture is being done. But we know from all over the world there are examples of how you can actually reward farmers for creating more diverse fields. Right? And if farmers have an incentive to create more diverse fields, they're going to look for the crops that allow them to create more diverse fields and still make sure they make a living out of this. And that's where I think we need to start working. So think of the whole system, but the system has many components with many different contexts, and in each context we need a different combination of instruments that basically tries to bring about the change we want. So that's the challenge, I think. And then it's a question about how we do it, not so much where we want to get, because that's more or less defined. But I think we are not there yet.
Thank you. So you are 4 people representing 4 institutions at the Vaughan University. I know there's more who deal with the issue of crop diversity and agrobiodiversity. But can you see a common thread or concern behind the diversity of your work? And can that be used for more cooperation or improving synergies, as we like to call it these days? We're always looking for synergies. So would you like to start again, Professor Weigand?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question. I got a chance to think about it beforehand. I can't really answer that very positively. I do not at present. I do not see the strong interaction between those different actors. Partly because for each of us, it's only part of the portfolio. Of course, crop diversity for me, as far as science goes, it's a very small part of my portfolio. But partly also for, I think, political dividing lines in that entire community of agriculture and biodiversity. I think that the focus of some working groups in the agricultural faculty is very much towards optimizing traditional agriculture, and then others look more into the aspects we're dealing with here. So I think maybe bringing that together would be an idea, but I do not really see that happening at the short term.
Yeah, I mean, we are doing mostly research in the global south, so there's already this kind of spatial dimension that makes it sometimes difficult to link up. But nevertheless, I mean, we know, and I mentioned this before, there are these impacts, they spillover effects that are happening elsewhere, and they are, of course, something that link us together. And I think the general sustainability debates, they are the kind of the linking grounds that we can work on. And I would also say that we are already collaborating in some projects. So Jan and I, for example, are working together, and not necessarily always on crop diversity, but maybe more biodiversity in general and land use change. Yeah. But there is already a lot happening, and of course there could be more. I agree with that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't ask the question anymore because you've heard it, so
yes.
I'm saving my breath.
Yes. No, I would agree with you that with both of you that more can be done. I think there's a common awareness, at least. Yeah. So we are not trying to, or we have a common. I think a common ground for starting research. But then we're also working in a complementary way, which is good for diversity reasons. So in terms of bringing us together, I think that would be good. But maybe specialization in academia is also so great that it holds us back from more interdisciplinary research, and that makes it difficult, or sometimes difficult, to actually look for collaboration just next door.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, if you put us into one room to ponder about this question, which we did, I think we have a lot of things in common. I think we were easy to agree on what the problems are. It was also easy to agree on where the goal should be. The challenge is to find some common narrative around which we would create a common initiative where all the complementaries are fully exploited. And just a hypothesis, I think, that came out in some of our discussions is that technology, not in the sense of new agricultural technologies, but technology in the sense of improving or changing the ways we do research is one common denominator that could bring us together. So there's a lot of technology development in monitoring. So we can learn a lot more faster about biodiversity today than we could 20, 50 years ago. And we can also use that information and integrate it regionally or globally at different scales, bringing new spatial data sets together. So I think digitalization is one aspect of this, of course. I think there's an opportunity where new ways of interdisciplinary cooperation could actually occur. And we actually started to exploit these. The question is not so much that we are so divided. The question is really time. You find time, and there must be something where you think, okay, I can get there without having to work for the next 2 years. So an opportunity, a window of opportunity, and at the right time would help. But I think there are lots of ideas that could be exploited, and to bring these ideas forward.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and bringing in your perspective and knowledge. The applause, please, for this group of experts who joined us. You may return to your lovely seats on the side. And before I hand over to Stefan Schmitz, and he gets his microphone, because for some reason we put it somewhere where I can't see it, so Stefan Schmitz needs his microphone. Some points of important knowledge for you. I would like to draw your attention to the information materials that the Crop Trust team has provided for you. There are goodie bags, I heard, and the microphone is coming. There's a raffle. You can win the framed art prints outside if you just need to sign up for the newsletter. It's fairly easy. Unfortunately, those viewing us on the live stream, you cannot participate in this, but you can sign up for the newsletter if you go to the website of the Crop Trust, and the team is going to appreciate if you do. And if you want to learn more about the material and the raffle, please approach the Crop Trust team. And this is my final word and sentence. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, what we heard from the speakers, the discussions, introduction, that was so rich and so diverse. Really, it's hard to wrap that up in a few minutes. So I only can pick up very few points of that. What I found, to start with that, very important, and there are two aspects of diversity, or two levels of diversity, and we discussed those without explicitly mentioning that. We talked about this diversity on the level of varieties, very obvious. Yeah, so we have wheat, rice, maize, legumes, tomatoes, fruits, everything. But we also touched on the diversity on genetic level. Yeah? And the threat really is on both levels. On both levels. Everything is disappearing. We lost 75 around, according to FAO estimates, around 75% of diversity of varieties in the field during the 20th centuries. There is strong indication that the genetic erosion is really a problem that is huge. Yeah? So there is a need to conserve this. This is a life insurance for us. We will need it in the future. All economists' wisdoms tell us, don't put all your eggs in one basket. I mean, that is exactly what we are doing now. That is exactly what we are doing now, yeah? We do not diversify our portfolios, diversify our option we have, and that is risky. And that makes the food system vulnerable. And when we talk about strengthening resilience in food system, everything starts with seeds, with new seeds, better seeds, and with a huge variety of seeds. The loss of diversity and the need to conserve it, and conservation first, that was, I think, very clearly, is a global challenge. Yeah, so we address this globally. And in this context, on this global level, I found this discussion around costs quite interesting. And the clear notion that unhealthy foods tend to be cheap, healthy foods tend to be expensive and not affordable for many people. And this is true for people in the north, but it's in particular true for people in the global south. And that brings us, and that was quite clear, we discussed this issue of crop diversity as a global challenge, but also then we looked at the global south. Farmers there need access to land, to water, to inputs, to knowledge, to markets, to a lot of things, but they also need access to seeds, to better seeds. And there was one clear good message, good news that gives us hope. It is comparatively cheap. It's cheap investment in research, agricultural research and development. And the conservation of this diversity we are talking about is the raw material for this agricultural research and development. And it's easy. They are low-hanging fruits. With relatively little money, we can lift relatively 100 million of people out of poverty. And that should give us hope and give us a strong argument for the conservation of this diversity cause this diversity matters. Another important aspect was international cooperation. Multilateralism is something in this field that really matters. It's good. It's good that we have an instrument like the International Plant Treaty. Yeah, that is one of the multilateral instruments we have on Earth, which is completely underestimated in its importance. Yeah? And multilateralism is something that really matters. And working towards one global gene bank, or one global gene bank system. And that brings me finally now to the work of the Crop Trust. We not just provide funding to individual gene banks, but also very explicitly try our best, contribute to make this huge variety of gene banks become an integrated global system of gene banks. And that is really important to increase efficiency, effectiveness, goal orientation, and sustainability of the entire system. that is what we are doing. We hope to be able to receive more funds, that we are able to invest more into this global system, and we would also like to invest more in awareness raising, in putting this issue of crop diversity higher on the political agenda. And the discussion we had here tonight encouraged me that this is the right way. This is the right way to go. With that, I would like to thank all the speakers and panelists, everybody here. I would like to thank you, De Lange, for the great moderation, facilitation of that evening. Wonderful. And I would like to thank all the helping hands in the background, technicians and others here. And of course, all of you for coming here, for joining in. And I hope you still have some more time now to join in step 1 floor up, where there is a reception and where we can continue discussion, networking, exchange, or simply just have fun for tonight. Thanks very much for coming.